April 17th, 1944. The wind over the Texas plains carried the faint smell of dust and gasoline. Barbed wire shimmered beneath the noon sun, stretching across miles of flat earth where the war seemed like a distant storm. Inside the wire stood hundreds of men in faded field gray uniforms, the remnants of Rommel's Afrika Korps, captured in Tunisia the year before. They had fought in blistering heat, through sandstorms and tank duels, under skies filled with British and American bombers. Now they stood bewildered, watching a scene they could not comprehend. Across the yard, American soldiers were drawing white chalk lines on the dry earth, driving metal stakes, unrolling worn-out gloves, and setting up a baseball diamond. The German prisoners stared through the fence, murmuring to one another. It wasn't a drill, and it wasn't punishment. The guards were laughing, arguing about bats and teams. The Americans were preparing for a game. When a sergeant called out in broken German, "You boys want to play?" The camp fell silent. Even the wind seemed to pause. Some of the prisoners smiled uncertainly. Others narrowed their eyes, convinced it was a trick. War had taught them not to trust the kindness of the enemy. They waited for the laughter that never came. The invitation was real. The guards were offering them a place on the field. At that moment, the strangest battlefield of World War II was being drawn not in Europe, but in the heart of Texas. Beneath the same sun that scorched tanks in El Alamein, German and American soldiers were about to face each other again. This time, not with rifles, but with baseball bats. To understand how such a moment could exist in the middle of global war, one must first understand the scale of what America had built. By 1944, the United States was home to over 400,000 German prisoners of war, scattered across 500 camps. Most were captured in North Africa or Italy, shipped across the Atlantic in Liberty ships that had once carried tanks and ammunition. The Geneva Convention of 1929 required humane treatment, but no one expected it to be generous. Yet when these men stepped off the trains into America's vast interior, they entered a world of order and abundance that felt unreal. The camps were run like small towns. Each had barracks, mess halls, hospitals, even libraries. In some, prisoners built furniture, farmed fields, or worked in canneries alongside civilians. They earned small wages, 8 cents an hour, credited to their accounts, and were fed better than many civilians in bombed-out Germany. For soldiers raised on propaganda that depicted Americans as barbarians, the reality was disorienting. Some called it a trick of morale. Others whispered that perhaps their leaders had lied. At Camp Hearn in Texas, the desert wind blew through endless rows of wooden huts. The guards were young Americans, farm boys and factory workers, trained more in patience than cruelty. They had seen combat footage from Europe, knew about the U-boat sinkings and the bombed hospitals, yet they treated their prisoners with a strange, methodical decency. For the Americans, it was about order. For the Germans, it felt like a kind of mercy they couldn't understand. One former prisoner, years later, would recall how the camp first seemed like a dream. The guards carried rifles but rarely shouted. The food came hot, not from tins but from kitchens. Evenings were quiet except for the faint hum of distant radio music. The Andrews sisters singing about a war the prisoners had lost long before the shooting stopped. In that stillness, baseball became a ritual. It began with the guards, who played to break the monotony of watching fences and counting heads. The sound of the bat, the sharp crack against leather, cut through the long afternoons like laughter in a cathedral. Curiosity drew the Germans closer. Some had seen American films before the war, but few understood the rules. The diamond looked like geometry drawn on dust, its logic hidden behind foreign shouts. When the first invitation came, it wasn't formal. The guards needed more players. Someone tossed a glove to a blonde prisoner who had once played football in Hamburg. He fumbled it, laughed, and stepped onto the field. That small act, simple, unplanned, was the start of something no one had expected. They played clumsily at first. The Germans swung too early, ran the wrong direction, shouted in confusion. The Americans laughed, not mockingly, but as if remembering that laughter still existed. Slowly, something shifted. The prisoners learned the rhythm of innings, the curve of the ball, the satisfying weight of a hit that sent dust flying into sunlight. The guards taught them how to slide, how to catch, how to call a strike. From the towers, officers watched in silence. They had orders to maintain discipline, to avoid familiarity, yet even they couldn't ignore what was happening below. Two enemies, trained to kill each other, were playing a game that demanded trust. On the field, the uniforms didn't matter. The rules were fair. The language was gestures, nods, and laughter. At dusk, when the game ended, something unspoken lingered in the air. The Germans walked back behind the wire, grinning and exhausted. The Americans packed up their bats, still smiling. The fences stood unchanged, but for a few hours they hadn't mattered. News of the baseball game spread quietly among the camps. Some officers worried it would soften discipline. Others encouraged it, noting that morale improved and violence decreased. The Red Cross inspectors took notes approvingly, but among the prisoners, the effect ran deeper. They began to question everything they had been told about the enemy. One recalled that after months in captivity, he stopped seeing the guards as Americans at all, just men who shared cigarettes and threw fastballs. The U.S. Army saw the results too. Productivity rose in work detachments. Escape attempts declined. The games, it turned out, were more powerful than propaganda. They offered the prisoners a glimpse of what life could be when hate was replaced by rules and fairness. By a game that rewarded skill, not slogans, but not everyone approved. In Berlin, German radio warned that prisoners were being corrupted by American decadence. Secret messages urged loyalty, reminding them that the fatherland still lived. Inside the camps, hardline Nazi groups tried to intimidate others, painting baseball as treason. Fights broke out in barracks between those who still believed in the Reich and those who had begun to believe in something else. Perhaps even forgiveness. The guards noticed the tension. Yet when the next Sunday came, they set up the diamond again. And the prisoners came. This time, entire teams formed, complete with nicknames and cheers. Some carved makeshift bats from pine, others stitched gloves from scraps. The games grew longer, the laughter louder. And though the war outside still burned, from Normandy to the Pacific, the men here were learning that enemies could share the same sky, the same rules, the same fragile peace of 9 innings. As the sun dipped below the Texas hills, an American guard leaned on his bat and looked toward the wire. A German pitcher nodded from the mound, ready for another throw. The crowd, guards, prisoners, officers, watched in perfect silence. The pitch came fast. The hit was clean. The ball soared into the fading light, crossing the fence, landing somewhere beyond the barbed wire, where no one could follow. It was just a baseball game. But for a brief, impossible moment, it felt like something more. It felt like the war itself had paused to take a breath. And in that stillness, neither side knew that this strange act of sportsmanship would ripple far beyond the fences, that what began as a game in Texas would soon become a quiet weapon of transformation inside the hearts of the captured. The sound of that baseball cracking. Through the afternoon, air lingered long after the dust settled. For many of the German prisoners, it was their first glimpse of something they couldn't name. A kind of freedom that existed within rules, not beyond them. It was strange, disarming, and contagious. By the summer of 1944, what had begun as a single casual game had become a phenomenon spreading through the entire network of American prisoner-of-war camps. From Texas to Kansas, from Georgia to Minnesota, fields of dirt and chalk appeared behind barbed wire. And the Germans, soldiers who once marched beneath swastikas, were now arguing about strikes and curveballs under the eyes of their former enemies. In the official army records, these events were filed under recreational activities. But for the men inside those fences, they became something else entirely. A new language. Baseball, alien to Europe's rigid sports of hierarchy and precision, carried with it the spirit of improvisation. The Americans played with swagger, with arguments and laughter, with movements that felt wild but fair. To the prisoners, this unpredictability was intoxicating. You could lose with honor, one former POW remembered decades later. Because even in defeat, you were part of something equal. The same men who had once saluted under the gaze of total authority now found themselves cheering for opposing players, slapping hands, joking with guards. It was a revolution built on bats and gloves. Yet beneath the easy laughter, the games carried deeper motives. American intelligence officers had taken notice. The office of the Provost Marshal General, responsible for all POW camps, saw baseball as more than recreation. It was re-education. By teaching enemy soldiers American sportsmanship, they hoped to erode the militaristic obedience drilled into them by Nazi ideology. Memos circulated from Washington describing the psychological benefits of competitive play and urging camp commanders to encourage it. Instructors were advised to explain the game's unwritten rules: fair play, teamwork, individual effort balanced with cooperation. These weren't just lessons in sport. They were quiet introductions to democracy. At Camp Algona in Iowa, the transformation became most visible. The Germans there built their own stadium, seating, scoreboards, even homemade uniforms stitched from flour sacks. Each team bore a name that echoed both humor and homesickness. The Rhineland Reds, the Bremen Bats, Africa Tigers. When American guards challenged them, hundreds of spectators, prisoners and soldiers alike, gathered to watch. A local newspaper later described the scene with disbelief. The crack of the bat echoed across the prairie as former enemies competed not for conquest, but for cheers. The technicalities of the sport fascinated the prisoners. They studied the aerodynamics of the baseball's spin, the timing between bat speed and trajectory. Some, former engineers or mechanics, kept meticulous notes. One, a Luftwaffe mechanic named Dieter Voss, built a makeshift pitching machine using scavenged springs and bicycle parts. Guards began calling him Doc, impressed by his precision. Decades later, that same man would teach physics at a university in Hamburg, always beginning his lectures with a story about the Texas sun and a curveball that refused to break. These small acts of curiosity and innovation echoed the war's larger paradox: how enemies, given enough time and humanity, could learn from one another. The Americans watched with growing respect as their captives adapted quickly. "They picked up the game faster than we expected," one sergeant wrote in a letter home. "Hell, some of them can hit better than we can." The lines between guard and prisoner began to blur. Not through defiance, but through routine human contact. When a German player broke a finger sliding into base, the camp medic set it carefully, and the guard who tagged him out sent a pack of cigarettes as a get-well gift. But not all officers approved. Reports reached higher command, warning that such fraternization might weaken discipline and reduce respect for authority. A colonel visiting from Washington demanded the games stop immediately, calling them a frivolous misuse of military time. The guards protested. They argued that the games reduced violence, improved cooperation, and kept men focused. Eventually, the colonel relented, but the incident revealed the thin line America walked, between showing strength and showing mercy. Outside the fences, the world burned. Normandy was still fresh, the Ardennes yet to come. But in these quiet corners of the American heartland, the war seemed paused. The crack of bats replaced the thud of artillery. German voices once filled with command bark softened into shouts of "safe" and "strike." A visiting journalist from the Saturday Evening Post described one such game in Louisiana. The sun fell red behind the watchtowers. The guards leaned on their rifles and smiled. Behind the barbed wire, the prisoners laughed. For a moment, there was no side, no front, only the game. The transformation did not go unnoticed in Germany. Through letters inspected by censors and reports gathered after the war, Berlin learned of the unusual leniency in American camps. Propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels raged privately that the Americans were corrupting the German spirit with their degenerate games. In his diaries, he warned that such softness would make repatriated soldiers unfit for the new Reich. He was right, but not in the way he intended. The cultural infiltration continued quietly. Baseball wasn't the only weapon of goodwill. It was simply the most visible. Camps organized libraries stocked with American novels and translated news articles. Some prisoners attended classes on English language and civics. They were introduced to democratic ideas, often wrapped in simple lessons about teamwork and fairness on the field. What began as a pastime evolved into philosophy. The guards never called it propaganda, but they understood its power. By late 1944, German teams were traveling between nearby camps for tournaments. Wooden buses carried them across the flat farmlands, escorted by soldiers who joked with them like teammates. Crowds of locals sometimes gathered to watch. For many American civilians, it was the first time they had seen a German face not as an enemy, but as a man in uniform sweating under the same sun. "They looked just like us," one spectator recalled, "only their accents were different." In one game at Camp Tonkawa, Oklahoma, a German pitcher named Karl Meissner struck out 10 American guards in a row. When the final batter fell, the crowd, both prisoners and soldiers, rose to their feet in applause. Meissner tipped his cap, and for a second, even the guards forgot who he was supposed to be. Later that night, one officer wrote in his diary, "I realized then that the war will end, but what we do here will decide what peace looks like." The engineers who had built weapons now crafted bats. The officers who once gave orders now debated baseball rules with Americans. A few prisoners even began writing articles for camp newsletters comparing the sport to European soccer. Discipline versus freedom, control versus improvisation. Baseball, one wrote, is democracy in motion. Every man has a chance to turn the game, but change came with conflict. The hardline Nazis still within the camps saw the growing friendship as betrayal. They formed secret cells, trying to enforce loyalty to the Reich, even assassinating suspected traitors. In response, camp authorities began separating extremists from moderates. The baseball fields, once simple recreation, had become ideological battlefields. On one side were men clinging to the old order. On the other, those beginning to believe that respect could exist without fear. As the war neared its end, those divisions deepened. The Allies were closing in on Berlin, and rumors spread among the prisoners. Hitler was dead, the Reich collapsing. Many refused to believe it. But on the field, belief didn't matter. The game went on. The same men who had once fought for domination were now playing for something simpler. A few moments of equality under an open sky. And in the distance, across the ocean, they would one day cross again. A nation already defeated was waiting for their return, never knowing that their soldiers were being transformed not by punishment, but by baseball. The third and final chapter would show what happened when those men went home and how a simple American game planted the first seeds of a new Germany. May 1945. The war in Europe was over. The guns had gone silent, the swastika banners torn from their poles, and the shattered cities of Germany lay under a sky filled with the smoke of surrender. Across the Atlantic, in hundreds of fenced-in towns scattered through the American heartland, the news arrived quietly, announced by camp loudspeakers, confirmed by tears, disbelief, and a hollow kind of relief. The German prisoners stood in stunned silence. Some wept. Some stared at the horizon, as if waiting for orders that would never come. The empire that had promised them glory was gone, and now they were left with only the strange lessons they had learned behind American fences. Lessons taught not by soldiers, but by a game. The baseball fields bloomed that summer with a new kind of energy. The games no longer carried the tension of enemy and guard. They had become instead a bridge between two worlds, the dying old one and the uncertain new. With the war officially over, the American guards relaxed, smiling more openly, shaking hands with the prisoners before and after games. Some even took team photographs, smiling faces, tanned under the Texas sun, unaware that these simple snapshots would one day appear in history books as quiet symbols of reconciliation. But beneath the laughter, a question haunted both sides. What would come next? The Americans knew the prisoners would soon be repatriated. For the Germans, it meant facing a homeland in ruins, cities bombed to ash, families scattered, hunger waiting. Yet the men who had played baseball behind barbed wire carried something with them, something they could not quite describe. It wasn't just the memory of the game, but the idea hidden inside it, that freedom was not chaos, that rules could protect rather than control, and that respect could exist even between enemies. The U.S. Army recognized the transformation. Reports submitted to Washington described a remarkable psychological shift among prisoners who had participated in camp sports and educational programs. These men, the reports claimed, displayed reduced hostility, increased cooperation, and adaptability to democratic environments. The War Department called it reorientation through recreation. Others called it something simpler: hope. At Camp Hearn, one of the earliest sites of the baseball games, American officers organized a farewell tournament before repatriation. The final match was played between a German team of Afrika Korps veterans and an American team of guards who had become their rivals and friends. Hundreds of prisoners gathered along the fence, cheering, waving makeshift banners. The air was thick with heat and nostalgia. When the German pitcher, Karl Meissner, wound up for his last throw, the crowd fell silent. The ball cracked against the bat and soared high, disappearing beyond the wire. The Germans erupted in applause, not for victory, but for the sound, for the moment, for the strange, shared life they had built in captivity. When the final inning ended, both sides stood together at the center of the diamond. No salutes, no ranks, just men. Someone began humming a tune, faint, unrecognizable, but carried on the wind like a hymn. In the months that followed, the ships began to sail eastward. The prisoners boarded in silence, carrying small bags and large memories. They left behind the wooden barracks, the dusty diamonds, and the people who had, in some impossible way, become part of their story. As they watched the American coastline fade, many felt a bittersweet ache. Some were going home to nothing. But others, especially the younger ones, carried notebooks, English words, and dreams of rebuilding. "We learned from the Americans," one wrote later in a letter to a friend, "not how to win a war, but how to lose one with dignity." When those men returned to Germany, they found a nation unrecognizable. The cities were skeletons. Food was scarce. Families were gone or broken. Yet amid the rubble, something remarkable began to happen. Former POWs who had lived in American camps, especially those who had played baseball, started forming small local clubs. They taught the game to children using improvised bats and balls stitched from rags. In 1946, The first organized baseball leagues in occupied Germany appeared in towns like Heidelberg and Mannheim. American GIs stationed there joined in, coaching, lending equipment, building fields. To outsiders, it looked like trivial entertainment. To those who remembered the camps, it felt like continuity, a thread of humanity stretching from the fences of Texas to the ruins of Europe. Sociologists studying the post-war years noticed an astonishing trend. German POWs who had been held in the United States reintegrated faster, adapted better to democracy, and showed less resentment toward the Allies than those held elsewhere. Many historians now trace this to the cultural exchange quietly taking place in those camps. Baseball, among other things, had taught them the architecture of fairness, the balance between freedom and responsibility. It sounds poetic, even naive. Yet for men who had lived under totalitarian control, that lesson was revolutionary. One former prisoner, Heinrich Wiese, later became a teacher in Hamburg. In an interview decades later, he recalled his first game behind the wire. "We stood there enemies with bats in our hands, and they told us, 'Play fair.' I thought it was a trick, but they meant it. They lived by it, and I realized perhaps that was their secret. Freedom with rules. Not fear but trust." His words, recorded by historians, captured what the War Department could never quite quantify, that America's true power had not come from its weapons, but from its values expressed through ordinary acts. By the early 1950s, baseball diamonds dotted West German cities, often built near American bases. The game became a small but enduring reminder of friendship. When West Germany re-entered the global stage as a democratic ally, it was these quiet cultural seeds that had already begun reshaping its national soul. Former POWs became translators, teachers, and bridge builders. Some even returned to America years later, not as captives, but as guests, invited by the same families whose sons had once guarded them. Back in the US, the legacy of those camps faded into the quiet corners of archives and family stories. The guards went home, built lives, raised children, and sometimes late at night told them about the strange days when they had played baseball with the enemy. "They were just boys," one veteran told his grandson decades later. "Same as us, just caught on the wrong side of a map." Over time, the photographs resurfaced, the smiling Germans in ragged uniforms, the American soldiers with bats slung over their shoulders. Historians found them, studied them, and realized their significance. They weren't just pictures of wartime leisure. They were glimpses of civilization surviving within catastrophe. Proof that even amid hatred, decency could endure. Psychologists studying post-war reconciliation cite the American POW camps as one of the earliest examples of cultural rehabilitation through humane treatment. The Geneva Convention had mandated fairness, but the Americans had gone beyond that. They had chosen empathy. They had chosen to teach rather than punish. And in doing so, they had created something extraordinary. Enemies who would return home as advocates for peace. In 1988, at a small ceremony in Germany, former POWs gathered with American veterans to commemorate the strange friendship born behind barbed wire. They wore baseball caps instead of helmets, their hair white, their faces lined but peaceful. They stood for a photograph, Americans and Germans together, and one of them, the old pitcher Meissner, said softly, "When they threw that first ball, they also threw away our hate." It is easy to imagine war as a story of bombs and battlefields, of tanks and flags. But sometimes, its deepest victories happen in places far from gunfire, in small, forgotten corners where humanity refuses to die. On dusty fields in Texas and Iowa, America fought a different kind of war, one not for territory but for hearts. And though history rarely writes about it, the results were profound. Because in those fenced fields, the victors did something rare. They invited the defeated to play. And in that invitation, something greater than victory took shape, a glimpse of peace, hidden in the arc of a baseball, crossing from one side of the wire to the other. When the ball left the pitcher's hand, it carried more than stitches in leather. It carried forgiveness. It carried a new beginning. And somewhere in that flight between enemies, the war, at least for a moment, truly ended.